Alright ladies, so this video will finish out your notes over chapter 3. I know it's pretty quick, but we've kind of skipped some things and bounced around and made our way through. So this is going to cover cycles of matter. I strongly recommend that you read this section in your textbook as well. So that's chapter 3, section 4, as I think that'll help this make a little more sense. You've also got your homework worksheet over cycles that you should use these notes and section 4 of your textbook to complete for next class. So this slide really reviews what we learned about in the previous chapter. You've got some major elements that living things are made of, including oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen, also sulfur and phosphorus. It's these first four that we're most concerned about. In fact, it's oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen that become the biggest deals when we look at nature. And these elements are the basis of our building block compounds, which should all look familiar. We talked about water in our last chapter, and then those four major biomolecules, so carbs, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Now when we talk about matter in nature, we see that matter gets recycled between and within ecosystems. So it's kind of like energy. Remember, energy is not created or destroyed, but it's transferred and transformed. Matter is going to do the same thing. It's going to move around, it's going to change form as it goes. But unlike energy, matter won't necessarily flow in a one-way stream. So matter forms more of a cycle, where it can go this direction, that direction, this direction, that direction, over and over again. Now in nature we call these biogeochemical cycles. I know that's a mouthful. But these are closed loops through which elements pass from one organism to another and also to the non-living parts of our biosphere. Now you're going to have the flow of energy right along with this to power it, and there are certain processes that make it go, and this is where we get the name. So we have biological processes, we have geological processes, we have chemical processes, and then we also have some human activities that are involved in these cycles as well. So, what do we mean by these things? Biological processes first. This is anything that a living organism would do. So, eating, breathing, generating waste, even dying, would all be biological processes. So you see some plants and animals here in these pictures. Geological processes mean the earth. Right, so this is movements of matter within and below Earth's surface. So if you get some soil changes, you get a volcano erupting, you form rocks, these would all be things that are not living, right, but they're just part of the Earth, and so we have a couple pictures here of erosion and a volcano. Now chemical, or sometimes called physical processes, would also involve non-living things, but not necessarily the planet. So things like clouds in the atmosphere, precipitation in the atmosphere, lightning in the atmosphere, and then water, which would be on Earth but technically not part of the solid planet. Anything that involves those deals we would call a chemical or a physical process. And then you have human activities last. Human activities would be things performed by humans that affect our environment. So when we burn or we mine for fossil fuels, things like coal and natural gas, when we farm the land, when we use fertilizers, when we cut down forests, any kind of action that a human would take that will change the landscape around us, like this oil rig right here out in the ocean drawing oil, or this farm machinery, if this is going to affect matter, it'll play a part in these cycles as well. So we're going to start with the water cycle. The water cycle is also sometimes referred to as the hydrologic cycle, and this is probably the simplest cycle, and also the cycle that you are probably the most familiar with yourself from previous classes. Remember that water is going to move between the oceans, the atmosphere, and then the soil or land. And as it does so, it's going to take some time to go through living organisms. It's also going to change form from liquid to gas and back to liquid again. So let's say we start here in the ocean. We've got liquid water covering a large proportion of the earth, and we can get evaporation from that point. Right? Evaporation meaning to change from liquid into gas form. We can also get transpiration. Transpiration is when water evaporates from plants. So this is sort of like when a plant sweats. So both of these, evaporation and transpiration, will turn water from liquid into gas. Condensation occurs in the atmosphere, and that means that water goes from gas back into liquid. And so condensation will take place within and forming clouds. Now once condensation happens to a large enough extent and you build up a lot of liquid in that cloud will precipitate out, meaning that we're going to drop that liquid water back down to the earth. Once we get to the earth, we're going to get runoff, which is where the water literally runs off of the land, whether it's landing on rock or whatever it might be. We're also going to get some seepage into the soil that you see here. And then you're going to have a layer of groundwater, which is beneath the surface of our ground. And that groundwater is eventually going to run its way back to the oceans. And so if we call that step 6, then we get back to where we started. And so what you'll notice is that this cycle is continuous. So that as this happens, we're going to just do one big cycle and the water can keep working its way back around. Now the other cycles we would call nutrient cycles, because nutrients we define loosely as these chemical substances that living things need to sustain life. You're going to need nutrients to carry out most of your functions. So to grow and develop, you're going to need some nutrients in the form of food. To reproduce, you need nutrients. To perform or to maintain homeostasis, you need nutrients. For metabolism, you need nutrients. In other words, we have to get nutrients because we need energy. Right? And so these nutrients that cycle through our planet are necessary for all of us that are alive. There's 3 major cycles, and these include the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. Now we're going to learn the most about the carbon cycle, but then you're going to have to know a little bit about these other 2 as well. We'll start with the carbon cycle. You'll notice it's kind of ugly. It's kind of convoluted over here, but there are particular things that I would like you to know about it. I would like you to know these different forms of carbon that we're about to go through, and I would like you to loosely know what these various processes are, most of which you should already kind of know what they are. So carbon is basically going to move from a gas form in the atmosphere to a gas form that's dissolved in the ocean to a solid form that can be found on the earth within soil, or a solid form that we can find within living organisms. But in other words, it's just going to continuously cycle, and so as you see, it's not one nice circle like we saw with the water cycle, but there's arrows going all over the place. So let's start with these forms. The first form I think we're all familiar with, and that's carbon dioxide gas. Right? This is a gas essential to photosynthesis, but it's a gas that can be dissolved in water as well. So you're going to see it here in the air, but you're also going to see carbon dioxide in the ocean. Now, the other types of carbon here are more solid types of carbon. The first one I want you to know about is called calcium carbonate, which is this right here. So let's write down here, calcium carbonate. Now this is going to be the major solid carbon you find in both land and in living organisms. So calcium carbonate is part of what makes your skeleton hard. Calcium carbonate is part of what makes rocks hard and dense. Now the other type of solid carbon that you see on the planet is oftentimes called fossilized carbon. And fossilized carbon is coal, oil, natural gas, all the types of fossil fuels that you may have heard of before. These are the major ways that we get energy here on our planet, and we'll talk about these later. They're called fossilized or fossil fuels because they take forever to develop. So you can get these carbon samples into the ground, and after being underground for millions of years, they will become fossilized and turn into these coal, oil, and natural gas locations that we can use to get energy. Now, as we already learned, carbon is also the major element in carbohydrates, and so that's another sort of solid form that we can see in living things and the major source of energy for living things. So fossil fuels are a major source of energy for the planet, and for us, having things such as electricity, while carbohydrates are your major type of carbon that we see for the energy of living things. Now, in terms of these processes, I think we're all familiar with photosynthesis, right? It uses carbon dioxide to form carbohydrates, so those carbs would end up in plants and animals. Respiration, when you breathe, right, that gives off carbon dioxide back to the air. Decomposition, so when a living thing breaks down, those carbon nutrients are going to go back into the soil. Deposition means that they become part of the deeper layers of the earth where they can become fossilized. Erosion is one way that we can see carbon move in the soil. Volcanoes will give off a lot of carbon dioxide gas when they erupt. So again, I think most of these terms you're kind of familiar with already, but make sure you would know what we mean if we say those. In no way do you need to memorize this cycle. You won't have to reproduce this picture or anything crazy like that for me. Alright, second nutrient cycle we want to learn is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is essential both structurally because it's part of your proteins, but also because nitrogen shows up in your genetic material, so DNA and RNA. This one is much like the carbon cycle here. I do not expect you to memorize the picture that you're going to see on the next slide, but I would like you to be familiar with these different forms we're about to mention, and I'd like you to be familiar with a couple processes that we're going to define a couple slides from now. So the forms of nitrogen, first one would be a gaseous form called nitrogen gas, N2 gas. This is actually 78% of our atmosphere. So 78% of our air is nitrogen gas. Now we also have some solid nitrogens, kind of like we had solid carbons. The first one is called NH3, or ammonia. Ammonia is actually usually in liquid form, but we can find that also around us on our planet. And then we have what are called nitrates and nitrites. Nitrates, nitrites. Now these are NO3 minus and NO2 minus. They are your major solid form of nitrogen that we see on our planet. You're going to find these in the soil. You're going to find these in organic wastes, otherwise known as poop. And you're going to find these in dead or decomposing organisms. And so nitrogen that's in the soil does so in the form of nitrates and nitrites. Now, fertilizers is the major way that humans put nitrogen into the environment. So whether that's fertilizer that you buy at Lowe's, that's little pellets that your mom or dad puts on your lawn, or that's fertilizer that is natural, again, which is poop from animals, or I guess humans don't really do that out in the field too frequently, but if you use animal poop to fertilize your fields when you're a farmer, I guess you're doing it. But this is the major way that humans put nitrogen into the atmosphere is through fertilizer. So here's a nitrogen cycle, right? Yuck. This is a really convoluted picture. So again, please don't memorize this. I just want you to see it. But as long as you know what those things are on the last slide, so nitrogen gas versus ammonia versus nitrates and nitrites, and you know the two processes that we're about to learn, you'll be good. So here's the two processes that you need to be familiar with. Notice both of these are primarily performed by bacteria around us, but they have a way to change nitrogen from a solid form to a gaseous form or the other direction as well. So the first one you want to know about is called nitrogen fixation. When you fix nitrogen, you are converting nitrogen gas into ammonia, which was liquid, right, which then gets turned into usable forms like nitrates and nitrites. So in other words, nitrogen fixation goes from gas to solid. And again, this is primarily performed by bacteria. Rhizobium is a type of bacterium that you see here, these little thingies, and also these darker thingies here on these roots are pods of rhizobium. And these are bacteria that fix nitrogen so that these plants can use it. So this is a sort of a friendly relationship between bacteria and the roots of plants. These bacteria take this gaseous nitrogen, turn it into solid nitrogen, which then these plants can use to be healthy. Now notice this is kind of cool. Nitrogen fixation can also happen when lightning strikes, and we call this atmospheric fixation. So literally, gaseous nitrogen in the air can turn into solid nitrogen when there's a lightning strike, and then that will fall down to the earth. So usually it's going to be such tiny amounts that you wouldn't notice getting hit by this nitrogen or anything like that, but it'll sort of settle like dust after a lightning storm. The opposite process is called denitrification. So denitrification is where we convert nitrates back into nitrogen gas, which gets released into the air. So denitrification is going from solid back to gas, and we see that happen usually via bacteria in our environment as well. Now the last cycle that you need to know about is called the phosphorus cycle. This one you really have to know the least about. Phosphorus is essential for our bone structure and also for our genetics. So again, DNA has a fair amount of phosphorus in it. Phosphorus you do not see much in the environment, and you see hardly any at all in the atmosphere. So in other words, gas phosphorus doesn't really happen. What you do see are two different types of solid phosphorus, and phosphorus is generally going to be found in the form of phosphates, which chemically is PO4. Now the major reservoirs are the places we find phosphates. On our planet we can find inorganic phosphates, which means not living, right? So inorganic, not living. So you're going to have phosphate in rock, you're going to see it in the soil, and you're going to see some phosphates dissolved in the ocean. Then we also have the organic phosphates, which would mean living things, and the organic phosphates are going to be found in DNA and RNA, so again genetic material, also in bones. So that's why I've got this fossil here. I took this picture myself in Chicago. If anybody's ever been to the Field Museum, this is one of the most complete T-Rex skeletons that there is on the planet. And so there's going to be a lot of phosphorus there. Anywhere where you have bones, particularly fossilized bones that have been basically turned into rock, you're going to see a lot of phosphates. Also, I'm not sure if you all knew this, but oftentimes what we call a neon light is technically a phosphorus light, and the light emits when you burn phosphorus. Natural burning of inorganic phosphorus gives you sort of a blue color, and so if you ever see a blue neon light, it's probably actually phosphorus, not neon. Okay, so here's the phosphorus cycle again. Don't memorize this one either, but notice it is quite simple. Basically, you're going to see phosphates in rock and soil. That's going to erode or wash away, which will take phosphates into the oceans. Some of this phosphate gets taken up into living things, so it's found in food webs. And eventually, when things die, the phosphate goes back into the water, finds its way to the soil, etc. So you really don't have to know processes or steps in phosphates. Just know that they can go from organic to inorganic and back again. Now, the last thing I want you to know about from this chapter that is quite important is what's called nutrient limitation. One of our final vocab words here is primary productivity. What this means is just how much are producers producing, right? So this is the rate at which organic matter is created. So at what rate are plants making chemical energy in the form of carbohydrates for us to eat? Right? So how much are they producing? A lot of times the productivity rate, or how much they are producing, is limited by one single nutrient. Basically, if they don't have enough of a certain nutrient, then they're not going to grow and they're not going to produce. And we call this a limiting nutrient. Now we can compare this to, say, those of you who baked cookies last week. Right? You might have had everything you needed for that recipe, but if you didn't have flour, or you didn't have butter, or you didn't have chocolate chips, you couldn't make chocolate chip cookies. Right? So let's say you got everything together, got home and realized you didn't buy any chocolate chips. That would be your limiting nutrient. Right? You can't make your cookies without that one thing that's missing. Or let's say you needed 2 bags of chocolate chips, but you only got 1. Now that's going to limit the number of cookies you can make. Right? So plants are in the same way. If they don't have enough of every nutrient they need, they're going to be limited by what they have the least of. Now usually sunlight can be limiting and water can be limiting. As we know, we need plants to be watered and to get sun. If those things are available, which is normally true out in the environment, then nutrients like the ones we've been talking about, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, are what limit your productivity. Alright, so an example of limiting nutrients is with crop plants. When a plant is growing, it can very often turn into a situation where the soil does not have enough of a certain nutrient for the plants to grow well. This is especially true year after year. So if a farmer's been growing corn on a given plot of land for 10 years, that corn is eventually going to start to sap the nutrients out of that soil. The same would be true for your lawn at home. So we oftentimes add a fertilizer to make up for this. This is true for a lot of families who put down a fertilizer like this one on their yard to make sure that every year their grass comes back green. But this is essential for farmers who have to make sure that their crops will grow from year to year on their given plots of land. Most fertilizers that we use commercially are a combination of 3 different nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So these are the most likely 3 nutrients that are lacking in the soil. So a lot of times if you buy a fertilizer at a home store, it has this little 3-number thing. You see 20, 27, 5. This is the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that's in these little pellets. So a lot of times they say the best ones for your lawn are actually even, so 20, 20, 20 or things like that. Of course, there's also natural fertilizer that we mentioned earlier, which is poop. Right? This is often used by farmers who raise cattle or horses as well, because these animals will fertilize the fields for you, basically. The feces or poop that comes from these guys has a lot of these nutrients in it, so it's going to add those back to the soil. Notice this though, not carbon. Carbon is never a limiting nutrient for plants. Anybody figure out why? I'll give you time to think about that for a second. Yeah, this right here, right? Plants get their carbon from air, from carbon dioxide, so they don't need carbon from the soil or anything like that. They will never be limited in carbon because they get it when they take in carbon dioxide. Now, you can also have an opposite example. So notice that I'm saying that here. So this is not an example of a limiting nutrient. This is an example of too much of a limiting nutrient. Right, and we see this a lot with aquatic algae growth, so water-based plants. A lot of times you will have a big rain which causes runoff from the soil or erosion into a lake or especially a pond. This happens a lot at golf courses and things like that. And this big rain is going to cause a major nitrogen runoff, which means you get a big, huge increase in nitrogen, which leads to an increase in growth. And when we see this in algae, what we see is this growth of algae at the surface of your pond, which makes your pond look kind of nasty. And this is called an algal bloom. So if we provide a lot of what was once a limiting nutrient, we can end up getting a whole lot of growth. All right, so this wraps up your notes for Chapter 3. As I said, I strongly recommend that you read Section 4 about cycles in Chapter 3 from your textbook as well, and then use this information to complete that homework worksheet on the different cycles. Thank you for listening.